the water is not deep. That is the first surprising thing. You could wade out to it. At the northwestern edge of Lake Issyk-Kul, in the mountains of Kyrgyzstan, the lakebed sits somewhere between 1 and 4 meters below the surface. Chest height in places, a shallow dive in others. Swimmers have passed over it for generations. Fishermen have anchored above it. Nobody thought much about the stones. In the autumn of 2025, a team put a remotely operated drone into that water and started mapping the floor in a grid. What came back was a town, not a scatter of debris, not a suggestive pile of rock. Streets, brick structures, collapsed walls still holding their alignment. Wooden beams, actual timber preserved for 6 centuries in the cold mountain water. A millstone, the kind used for grinding grain, lying where it fell. And spreading across roughly 300 meters by 200, a cemetery. A Muslim necropolis, its graves ordered and deliberate, dating to the 13th and 14th centuries. This was a place where people lived, traded, prayed, buried their dead, facing a direction that mattered to them. And then, sometime in the early 15th century, it went under. Press coverage reached for the obvious comparison almost immediately. Atlantis, a lost city beneath the waves. I understand the impulse, and I am going to argue against it for most of this video. Not because the find is less interesting than that, but because it is interesting in a completely different way. And the Atlantis framing gets in the way of seeing it. Atlantis is a story about a civilization punished and erased. Toru-aygyr is a story about a real town, on a real trade route, with a documented sequence of religions moving through it, destroyed by an earthquake we can approximately date. One of those is a myth. The other is a place where you can still see the millstone. And there is something else, which I did not expect when I started reading about this, and which turns out to be the reason this corner of the world matters far beyond a sunken town. The people buried in this region left gravestones, thousands of them, carved with crosses, inscribed in a Syriac script most people have never seen, by a Christian church almost nobody in the West remembers existing. And in the 1330s, those gravestones start recording something terrible. We will get there. Let's start with the lake. Issyk-Kul is strange, and its strangeness is the reason this story is possible. It sits at around 1,600 meters of altitude, ringed by the Tian Shan Mountains, in what is now eastern Kyrgyzstan. It is one of the deepest lakes on Earth, over 650 meters at its deepest point, deep enough to rank among the top 10 globally. It is enormous, roughly 180 kilometers end to end, and it has no outlet. That detail does more work than it sounds like. Water flows in from the mountains, dozens of rivers and streams fed by snowmelt, and none of it flows out. The only way water leaves Issyk-Kul is by evaporating, which means that everything dissolved in those rivers stays behind and accumulates. The lake is mildly saline as a result. Not seawater, but not fresh either. It also means the water level is not fixed. A lake with an outlet regulates itself. Rise too high, and it drains. A lake without one has no safety valve. Its level rises and falls with climate, with snowpack, with how much water the surrounding land is holding over decades and centuries. The name Issyk-Kul translates roughly as warm lake, and it earns it. Despite the altitude, despite mountains that hold snow most of the year, the lake does not freeze. The salinity helps, the depth helps, and the sheer volume of water means it holds summer heat well into winter. That last fact had practical consequences for anyone living there. A lake that stays open all winter is a lake you can still fish, still travel along, still water animals from. In a season when everything around you is locked in ice. In a mountain basin at 1,600 meters, that is not a pleasant detail. That is the difference between a place people pass through and a place people stay. So, picture the setting. A vast, deep, faintly salt lake that never freezes, high in the mountains, on a shoreline that has been shifting for as long as there have been people watching it. That is the environment, now the town. Toru-aygyr was not isolated. That is easy to assume, looking at a map of Central Asian mountains, and it is wrong. The Issyk-Kul Basin sat on one of the northern branches of what we now call the Silk Road. That name is a modern convenience, coined in the 19th century, not by anyone who used the routes. And it is misleading in two ways. There was never a single road. and silk was only one of the things moving along it. What existed instead was a network, dozens of routes shifting over centuries according to politics, water, and which mountain passes were controlled by whom. Goods moved in relays, not in single journeys. A merchant might carry a load 400 kilometers and sell it to another merchant who carried it 400 more. Very few people traveled the whole distance. The silk that reached Rome had changed hands a dozen times, and the cargo was far broader than fabric. Horses moved west and east. Paper technology traveled out of China. Glassware came from the Mediterranean. Spices, metals, furs, slaves, and coin all moved along the same tracks. So did diseases, which will matter shortly. A lake basin in the mountains, with fresh pasture, reliable water, a mild microclimate, and a route running along its shore, is exactly the kind of place a town appears. The settlement at Toru-Aygyr had been there since at least the 10th century, and possibly earlier. Archaeologists working the site place it firmly in the medieval period, thriving through the 10th to 13th centuries. That window covers an enormous amount of Central Asian history. The rise and fall of Turkic states, the eastward expansion of Islam, the Karakhane dynasty, and eventually the arrival of the Mongols. What was the town for? The evidence points at what you would expect from a road town: trade, craft production, agriculture. The millstone is not decorative. Someone was growing and grinding grain. A place where caravans stopped, where goods changed hands, where people who spoke different languages did business and then went home. And crucially, a place where people stayed. A trading post is temporary. A necropolis 300 meters across is not. You do not build a cemetery that size unless generations considered this home and expected their children to be buried there too. Which brings us to the most interesting thing about this settlement, and it is not a building. Maxim Menshikov, who leads the expedition from the Institute of Archaeology of the Russian Academy of Sciences, described toru-aygyr in its founding period as a multicultural city. That word gets used loosely. Here it is precise, and the specifics are remarkable. Before the 13th century, the people of this town practiced Tengrism, Buddhism, and Nestorian Christianity in the same settlement, at the same time. It is worth slowing down on each because most people have heard of exactly one. Tengrism is the oldest layer, the traditional belief system of the Turkic and Mongol steppe peoples, centered on Tengri, the sky. It is not a religion of scripture and cathedrals in the way we usually mean those words. It is bound up with sky and land, with ancestors, with the natural order and the authority of rulers who claimed the sky's favor. It was the spiritual framework of the nomadic world for a very long time, and it did not disappear when other religions arrived. It layered underneath them. Buddhism reached Central Asia early and traveled well. The same routes that carried silk carried monks, texts, relics, and monasteries. There were flourishing Buddhist communities across this region for centuries. Cave complexes, monastic centers, translation workshops turning Sanskrit into Chinese. That surprises people who think of Buddhism as belonging only to South and East Asia. For a long stretch of history, Central Asia was one of its heartlands. And then Nestorian Christianity, which is the one that tends to genuinely astonish. It deserves more than a paragraph, so it is getting its own chapter. But hold the picture first. A town on a lake shore in the mountains, where a man who prayed to the sky, a monk who followed the Buddha, and a Christian who had never heard of Rome could plausibly have shared a street, a market, and a business arrangement. That is not a curiosity. That is what a trade route actually does to a place. Routes do not just move objects. They move ideas, and ideas settle where people settle. Almost everyone knows Christianity spread west, into Rome, then across Europe, then to the Americas. Far fewer people know that it also went east and got a very long way. The story starts with an argument about words. Nestorius was Patriarch of Constantinople from 428. He became the center of a dispute over how to describe the nature of Christ, specifically how the divine and human natures related, and whether Mary should be called bearer of God or bearer of Christ. To modern ears, this can sound like hair splitting. In the 5th century, it was a question that could split an empire, and it did. Nestorius and his teachings were condemned at the First Council of Ephesus in 431, and the position was rejected again at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. What followed is called the Nestorian Schism. Churches that supported him broke from the rest of Christianity. And then his supporters did the thing that changes everything. Many relocated east into Sassanid Persia, where they joined the existing Christian community there, a church already outside Roman control, already operating in a Persian empire that was Rome's rival. That body became known as the Church of the East. Freed from the Roman world entirely, it started moving along the trade routes. It reached Central Asia, it reached India, it reached China. There is a stone stele in Xi'an, erected in the 8th century, recording a Christian community operating there under imperial permission, written in Chinese and Syriac. At its height, the Church of the East may have covered more territory than the Roman Church did. Its liturgical language was Syriac, a dialect of Aramaic, close to the language Jesus himself spoke. Its script is unfamiliar to most Western eyes, flowing and cursive, unlike Greek or Latin. And it left gravestones, hundreds of them, in this exact corner of Kyrgyzstan. More than 500 have been published from cemeteries near Tokmak and modern Bishkek, in the valleys west of Issyk-Kul. Large pebbles, shaped and carved with a cross and an inscription, some in Syriac, some in Turkic languages written in Syriac script, which tells you something on its own. These were not Middle Eastern colonists. These were local Turkic-speaking people who had become Christians and were being buried by their own community in their own language under a cross. One tombstone recovered from Lake Issyk-Kul itself carries an inscription in Uyghur and a date, 1312. They date, broadly, from around 1250 to 1342. That end date is not a coincidence. Here is where a local story becomes a global one. Those Nestorian cemeteries in the valleys west of the lake, Kyrgyzstan and Burana in particular, are unusual in archaeology because the graves are dated. Precisely. The inscriptions carry years and often names and sometimes a cause of death. For a medieval site, that is extraordinary. Most cemeteries give you bones and guesswork. This one gives you a register. When researchers went through the precisely dated burials, they found 467 of them. And of those 467, 118 came from just 2 years, if 1338 and 1339. A quarter of the dated burials in a cemetery used across roughly a century, compressed into 24 months. The inscriptions say why. Some state the cause of death directly in Syriac, pestilence. In 2022, a team published in Nature the result of testing ancient DNA from 7 individuals exhumed from those 2 cemeteries. In individuals whose tombstones read 1338, they recovered DNA from Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium. That alone would be significant. What made it extraordinary was where the strain sat. Plague genetics has a long-standing puzzle sometimes called the Big Bang, a moment when Yersinia pestis suddenly diversified into several lineages, and those lineages produced the pandemics that followed, including the Black Death, which reached Europe in 1347 and killed something on the order of half its population. Researchers had known that event happened. They had not been able to place it in time or geography. The strain from those Kyrgyz graves fell exactly on the origin point of that diversification, which means these people, this small Christian community in the mountains of Central Asia, speaking Turkic, writing in Syriac, burying their dead under carved crosses, died at the beginning, 8 years before the plague reached Crimea, 9 years before it reached Constantinople in Italy. Their gravestones are the earliest dated record of the pandemic that would reshape Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Now, the precision that matters, because it is easy to blur this, and I do not want to. Those cemeteries are not toru-aygyr. They lie in the Chui Valley, to the west, a separate community with a separate faith. The necropolis under the lake is Muslim, but it is the same region, in the same decades. When the plague broke out in those valleys in 1338, the town at toru-aygyr was standing, inhabited, and connected to the same trade network along the same shore. We do not know what happened to it in those years. Nobody has excavated toru-aygyr's necropolis for that answer yet. It is, however, a fairly urgent question. Step back to the town itself and the transition that reshaped it. The archaeological read on this is specific and worth stating carefully, because it flattens easily into a story about conquest. What the researchers describe is that the arrival of Islam reshaped the city's social and economic orientation, encouraging trade networks centered on Muslim communities. Read that again, because the economic clause is doing the work. This was not only a change of belief, it was a change of who you could do business with. In the medieval world, shared religion functioned as commercial infrastructure. It meant shared law for contracts, shared institutions for settling disputes, a shared language of trust between a merchant here and a merchant 2,000 kilometers away whom you had never met and would never meet again. A network of Muslim trading cities stretching from Spain to India was, among other things, an enormous integrated market with common standards. And being inside it was worth a great deal of money. So, a town that converted was not merely changing what it believed on a Friday. It was plugging into a different economy. That does not make the conversions insincere. People rarely separate their convictions from their circumstances as cleanly as we like to imagine, and a merchant who genuinely believed and also benefited would not have experienced any contradiction. But it does explain why the change shows up in the archaeology as an economic reorientation, and not just a religious one. And that is what the necropolis represents. The Muslim cemetery mapped beneath the water dates to the 13th and 14th centuries. After the transition, 300 meters by 200, laid out with the orientation Islamic burial requires. That is not a handful of graves belonging to visiting traders. That is a settled, established Muslim community, burying its dead by its own rights, across generations. The town that went under the lake was a Muslim town. The town founded on that spot centuries earlier was Tengrism, Buddhist, and Christian. Same streets, same lake, different world. Here is the part people find hardest to picture. Towns are on land, lakes are not on land. How does one become the other? There are two mechanisms, and at Issyk-Kul, both were probably in play. The slow one is water level, remember? No outlet. The lake's surface has risen and fallen substantially across historical time, driven by climate and by how much water the rivers were carrying. When the level rises over decades, the shoreline moves inland, and anything built close to the old shore is gradually taken. This is not dramatic. It is a house abandoned because the ground got wet, then a street, then a district, over the course of a lifetime or two. The fast one is seismic. The Tian Shan is an active mountain range. It exists because the Indian subcontinent is still driving north into Asia, and that collision is still producing mountains and still producing earthquakes. Large ones. The researchers working the site attribute the final submergence of toru-aygyr to a powerful earthquake in the early 15th century. An earthquake does not simply shake a town into a lake. What it does is stranger and worse. In waterlogged ground near a shoreline, violent shaking can cause saturated soil to lose its strength and behave, briefly, like a liquid. Ground that carried a building for 200 years stops carrying it. Structures sink into what was solid a moment earlier. Shorelines slump and slide into the water, taking everything standing on them. Whole sections of land can drop by meters. That fits what is on the lakebed. Collapsed structures with their walls still roughly in alignment, beams still lying where the building failed. A millstone in place rather than scattered across a debris field. This was not a town abandoned and slowly drowned. Parts of it went down while it was still standing. I want to deal with this directly because you will see the comparison in nearly every article about this find, and it distorts what happened. Atlantis is a literary device. Plato invented it in two dialogues as a moral illustration, an advanced and arrogant civilization destroyed by the gods for its hubris. It was never a report. It was a philosopher making an argument about power and virtue, using an imaginary island. Over 2,000 years, that fictional island has become the default template for how we discuss anything underwater. Archaeologists find a submerged structure, the headline reaches for Atlantis. The problem is not that the comparison is inaccurate. The problem is what it implies. Atlantis implies a mystery with no solution, a vanished super-civilization, knowledge lost forever. It invites you into a mode of thinking where the answer is unknowable, and therefore anything might be true, which is precisely the doorway pseudo-archaeology walks through. Once a site is the next Atlantis, every unfounded claim about it gets equal footing with the excavation report. Toru-aygyr is the opposite of that. We know roughly when it was founded, We know what religions its people practiced and in what order. We know it sat on a trade route and what that route carried. We know the approximate century it went under and the most likely mechanism. We know the fault system responsible. We know who is excavating it, which institutions they represent, and what equipment they used. There is no mystery here in the Atlantis sense. There is a town, a date range, a fault line, and a research team. That is a better story, not a worse one. A drowned imaginary utopia teaches you nothing about the real past. A drowned Silk Road trading town teaches you how religions moved along trade routes, how conversion and commerce entangled, how mountains kill cities, and how much of the medieval world is still sitting unexamined in shallow water a few meters from shore. The 2025 campaign was a joint operation, and its composition is worth noting. It brought together the Russian Geographical Society, the Institute of Archaeology of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and the Institute of History, Archaeology and Ethnology of the National Academy of Sciences of the Kyrgyz Republic, Russian and Kyrgyz scientists working the same site, which, given the region's politics, is itself a fact about how this research actually gets done. The technical setup is more interesting than it sounds. They deployed a Trionic 6M underwater drone linked to a hydroacoustic positioning system and a set of geolocation buoys. That combination solves the central problem of underwater archaeology, which is not seeing things. It is knowing exactly where you are when you see them. On land, you establish a grid, drive in stakes, and record every find by its coordinates within that grid. Underwater, you have no stakes and no fixed reference. Currents move you. Visibility drops without warning. The site looks identical in every direction. Without precise positioning, a diver who finds a wall cannot reliably tell you where that wall sits relative to the wall someone else found last week. And archaeology without spatial relationships is just a pile of objects. Hydroacoustic positioning fixes that. The buoys establish known points on the surface. The system tracks the drone's position against them acoustically, continuously. The reported result was tracking with no blind spots and roughly 4 hours of productive work per day. 4 hours sounds modest. In underwater archaeology, it is a great deal. And it is why a site people had swum over for generations finally produced a map instead of an anecdote. There is a counterintuitive fact in this story that explains the timing, and I think it deserves its own chapter. You would assume a site in 1 to 4 meters of water is easier to investigate than one at 50 meters. Shallower means simpler, surely. No decompression, no specialist gas, no darkness, no expensive submersible. In several important ways, the opposite is true. Shallow water near a shoreline is the most disturbed environment in a lake. It is where waves break, where storms churn the bottom and move sediment, where seasonal ice, boat traffic, fishing, and swimmers all leave their mark, where the water level itself has risen and fallen repeatedly, exposing and redrowning the same ground, sometimes over centuries. Deep water is the opposite, cold, dark, and still. Things that sink into deep sediment tend to stay exactly where they landed. That is why deep wrecks are often so astonishingly preserved. A ship at 400 meters can keep its rigging. A town in 3 meters of water has spent 600 years being rolled by every storm that crossed the lake. Its stones have shifted. Its surfaces have been scoured. Sediment has covered it, uncovered it, and covered it again. The expedition reports make this concrete. The shallow depth allowed teams to grid the lakebed and revisit structures after storms stirred up sediment. Revisit because a single storm can undo a week of survey, and you go back and find it all over again. So, the reason nobody mapped this until 2025 is not that it was hidden. It is that shallow, murky, constantly disturbed water is genuinely difficult to survey systematically. And it took the right combination of positioning technology and sustained institutional effort to do it properly. The city was never lost. It was just never recorded. The honest limits of this find are worth laying out, because the coverage tends to skip them. We do not know the town's medieval name. Toru-aygyr is the name of the modern village on the shore nearby. What the people who lived there called their own city, in whichever of their several languages, has not been established. We do not know its size. Mapping is ongoing. What has been surveyed so far is a portion of the site, not its full extent. Any population figure you see is an estimate built on assumptions about density. We do not know exactly when it went under. A powerful earthquake in the early 15th century is the working explanation and a reasonable one, but it is not a date. Seismic history here is reconstructed from geology and fragmentary records, not from a logbook. We do not know whether it was destroyed in one event or several. Gradual inundation and sudden collapse are not mutually exclusive. A rising lake could have taken the lower district across decades, and an earthquake finished the rest in an afternoon. The evidence so far does not cleanly separate them. We do not know what the plague years did to this town. The Nestorian cemeteries west of the lake recorded their catastrophe in stone. Toru-Aygyr's Muslim necropolis, sitting under 3 meters of water, has not been excavated for that question. It may hold an answer, it may not. And we do not know how much more is down there. Issyk-Kul is 180 kilometers long. The 2025 work covered one area in the northwest. The same processes that put toru-aygyr underwater: shifting levels, active faults, settlements clustered on a shoreline, applied to the entire perimeter for the entire time people have lived here. That last point is the one to watch. This is not a conclusion. It is a first proper survey. I want to end on the ordinariness of it because that is what stays with you. There was nothing exceptional about toru-aygyr. It was not a capital. It produced no famous ruler, no monument anyone wrote home about, no text that survived into a library. It was a working town on a road, in a basin where the grass was good and the water never froze, doing what such towns do. People were born there and expected to die there. That is why there is a cemetery 300 meters across. They changed religion at least once, and the archaeology suggests they did it for reasons that were partly spiritual and partly about who they could trade with, which is a very human combination, and not one people usually admit to out loud. Not far away in the next valley, another community carved crosses on river stones and wrote in the language of Jesus, and in 1338 started burying its dead faster than it could record them. And all of them built on a shoreline that had been moving for as long as anyone could remember, beside mountains that were still rising, on ground that had every geological reason to fail. They built there anyway, because the water was there, and the road was there, and that is where towns go. Then one day the ground stopped holding, and the lake came in. The strange thing is how little separates that from now. Every coastal city on Earth sits on a shoreline that moves. Most of the largest ones stand on ground that is, geologically speaking, provisional. We build where the water and the roots are, and we assume the arrangement is permanent because within a single lifetime, it always looks permanent. Toru-Aygyr made the same calculation and was wrong by a margin of about 4 meters. Someone swam over it every summer for 600 years without knowing what was underneath.